Character death is a tricky part of writing. It's a risky venture that can completely alienate your crowd or get them more invested. However, there's something that's even more risky than killing off your characters. That being reviving a character from death. There's many ways to go about it, and there's many examples of great ways to resurrect your character. Some being Lord of the Rings with Gandalf the White, the first time Dragon Ball resurrected Goku, Jason Voorhees in Friday Part 6, and not to count the various times Doctor Who has revived characters from death. But there's also a ton of examples where they completely fumbled the bag. Ripley in Alien Resurrection, Brian Griffin.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
We could talk all day about the worst and best examples of this trope. But what if you tried to revive a character that was originally meant to just be a one-off? A character that was only meant to be a temporary fixture in your plot? Well, the writers of Star Wars The Clone Wars did just that when they revived Darth Maul. Now, while to some this was a controversial decision, even at the time, though especially today since Disney Star Wars rarely lets anyone stay dead. Somehow though, this particular time it worked, and it paid off dividends for Star Wars. Maul went from someone who just looked cool to now a beloved fan favorite character. He's definitely one of my favorite characters in the Star Wars series. He's developed into a character that has presence on screen. Whenever something involves Maul, you can now be certain something interesting will come out of it. Let's look back through those first 6 episodes from Star Wars The Clone Wars Seasons 4 and 5. Was it always this great, or were just Star Wars fans huffing pain at the time? Well, let's look back into that together. Hopefully you enjoy the video, comment, like, share, and whatever else you want to do. But let's look into Darth Maul, and specifically, how to revive a character. Before we get into the specifics of how they pulled this off within the show itself, let's examine some of the history that led up to this point. Originally, Darth Maul was just a villain only meant for one film. He was meant to look cool, intimidate, kill Qui-Gon, and then leave. A sort of antagonist to show Palpatine had apprentices to do his bidding, similar to Vader in the original trilogy, but nothing really more than that. He looked the part, sure, his design was phenomenal, the red skin, the dark tattoos, the two-ended lightsaber. It was nothing like anyone had seen before. I think every single one of his kids could admit Maul was at least one of the coolest looking characters in Star Wars, next to the Fets, Vader, Grievous, and Sai Snoodles. No, just me? That's just me? Do you think they give, like, crazy job?
Why would you say something so controversial yet so brave?
Anyways, the most exposure we got from Darth Maul was in the video games primarily. There was also the occasional comic here and there, but overall he was a pretty static character. He looked cool, was good at fighting, and wanted to kill Jedi. That's really about it. So color me surprised that out of all the people, it was George Lucas's idea to bring back Darth Maul. Dave Filoni, one of the leads in the Clone Wars, had this to say to Entertainment Weekly. I found it funny in The Phantom Menace when Darth Maul got cut in half. I thought George was definitively saying this to the fans. There's no way this character is coming back. This is not a Boba Fett Sarlacc pit situation here. Because of fan love, Boba gets out of that thing any number of ways. Fast forward 10 years and I'm the one who has to bring Darth Maul back. Of course, George has always been an idea guy. He's not one to let an idea go unexplored if he genuinely believes there's something there to be explored. So I guess I can't be too surprised. But what Filoni said had merit too. The guy was cut in half and fell down an endless pit. To the viewer, that communicates the guy is dead. It's pretty risky to go back on that. You could potentially betray the viewer's trust, especially if it was done poorly. Yet, The Clone Wars is an animated project. So would they bring in Ray Park to do motion capture? Would they bring back the original voice actor? Well, Filoni had this to say on the Rebel Force podcast.
Well, I mean, I've met Ray and I've talked to Ray. In fact, I told Ray about this whole Maul thing happening quite a while ago, and I got to give him a lot of credit because he certainly never spilled the beans on it. So, I mean, he's great. I've been really fortunate to meet him several times, but our schedules didn't really line up in this situation because he's been very busy on the new G.I. Joe project. So it's been really hard for everybody to get the synchronicity of the timing of it, and so it didn't really interface. Luckily, we have a ton of reference material from the films and footage that he filmed and behind the scenes, and we had all of that, to draw from for what we were doing with Maul. And some things that Maul is doing are I don't want to say they're different, but they have to be different by nature of, the whole leg issue than perhaps some of the things that where Rey was fighting. So it's going to be definitely one of the hardest things we've had to do on the show is resurrect Darth Maul. And to me, the exciting thing about bringing Darth Maul into the show at the end of the day is that now you don't know what happens to him. You don't know. Mm-hmm. I mean, is he alive? Is he not alive? How is he alive? And what ultimately happens to this guy? He is a classic character that once he's back, returned from the dead or whatever is going on with him, you don't know what happens to him. And we've never had that situation before because Chewbacca at a certain point turns up in A New Hope and you know more of his story, but you don't know going forward what's going to happen to this rather iconic character. So that's an interesting twist, and it's only something that George could make happen. He's sitting in the writer's room saying, we're going to do this, and all of us saying, that's going to be a challenge because you cut him in half.
So from that we can assume two things. It was a proper challenge to revive Maul, but also Ray Park was out of the picture. Not a complete game ender, but with a new direction in mind, it was apparent that they wanted a new voice for the character. Luckily, Sam Witwer was the guy who landed the role. And can I say here that Witwer's longtime role as Darth Maul is one of the most iconic parts of the series at this point. It also helps that Witwer is a massive fan of the series and he just really gets why it works. He got his start in Star Wars playing the main character, Starkiller, in the Force Unleashed game, which is a treasured game in the Star Wars community. He had this to say about his work on Star Wars on the Inside You podcast.
Wow. And then because of Force Unleashed, Dave Filoni hired me for Clone Wars, which is where my voiceover career began, basically.
How many episodes of Clone Wars did you do?
I can't remember. It was something around 11 or something like that. But the thing is, whenever I was in it, it was a big deal. They always made a big deal about it. So it feels like I'm in the show more than I was. But basically, it started with this character called the Son of Mortis, who they were like, you want to do Clone Wars? I'm like, yeah, sure. And they're like, it's a really cool role. I'm like, I just already said yes. You don't have to say that, whatever. And then eventually I find out that you're like, no, you're playing the dark side of the Force. There's this dream world, and Anakin and Obi-Wan and Ahsoka are in this dream world, and they meet this character named the Son. And the audience is going to dawn on them that this is actually the voice of the dark side, just trying to turn everyone, and manipulate events. And so I did that. And then after that, me and Dave became friends because we were nerding out on stuff. He just kept
hiring you.
And then eventually he was like, hey, so, you got some friends in Lucasfilm. I'm doing my Dave impression now. I got some friends in Lucasfilm, so you probably know we're going to bring Darth Maul back. I'm like, yeah, I've heard. And he's like, what do you think about that? I'm like, I don't know about that, dude. I don't know if that's a good idea. He's like, okay, well, maybe we got something for you in the future. So thanks for coming in and see you later. And I'm like, oh, and I didn't make I'm like, oh, so I'm going to play a bounty hunter? He's like, yeah. And you haven't been listening to the conversation. Okay, cool. See you later. I had no idea. So he calls me a year later and he's like, so I need Darth Maul. Can you do it? And I'm like, what?
Give me your best Darth Maul.
Well, so Darth Maul from The Phantom Menace was voiced by Peter Serafinowicz. And he was at last we will reveal ourselves to the Jedi. At last we will have revenge. So I had to use that voice as the building block to create my Darth Maul, which has elements of both, but it goes in its own direction, you see.
Not gonna lie, I love how Witwer and Filoni seem to have this pretty friendly relationship. At least that's how it seems. I don't know, it just seems kind of wholesome, So yeah, only thing now to talk about is the story itself, which I'll gladly start. This will go a bit differently than usual. Instead of doing this how I traditionally review something, which is to discuss the elements like characters, plot, and so on, this will be more focused on how Maul is written in this character. Basically, we're focusing heavily on Maul and his presence within the plot. So this is more of a character study, if anything. I'd say Maul's resurrection arc splits evenly into 3 episode sections. The first half being his reintroduction, and the second half we'll call making an impression. So, let's begin with the first episode here is not super Maul-centric, but rather it's to show us where Maul has been, and show us how much he's changed since then. And well, he's definitely worse for wear. We find Maul a physically and mentally destroyed mess, trapped on the junk world of Lotho Minor, which the symbolism here is not lost on me. This world, much like Maul after his failure to kill Kenobi in The Phantom Menace, is dejected. abandoned and left to rot by the world, merely because he was deemed ineffective. The only thing keeping him around is his hate, which maybe is good enough to keep you functioning, but not great for your mental health. Thus his brother, Savage Opress, which I'll add here is one of the goofiest names in all of Star Wars, has to get involved and take them back to their home, to resurrect a new, more angry, more vengeful version of Maul. From here, we see Maul essentially just try to reveal himself to the Jedi, mainly trying to drag Kenobi out and attempt to get his revenge. What interests me here is Maul's heavy focus on attaining dominance in these 2 episodes. He's trying to gain some sort of foothold in the world through any sort of power, money, strength, and even forcing his brother to be his apprentice. It's interesting to me because, at least in the movies, we've always encountered the Sith when they're in a position of power, usually hiding as a political figure or hiding in the shadows. Yet here we find Maul, a Sith who's functionally at their weakest. And in a sense, this gives us a lot of insight in the mind and beliefs of the Sith, what they focus on versus what the Jedi would do. It's an incredibly clever way to deliver world building to the audience through character work, which is the best way to do it in my opinion. I'd say throughout this arc he's acting pretty reckless, but I wouldn't say he's being completely stupid. One thing that should be noticed is that Maul doesn't go straight to the Republic or the Separatists. He knows they're already compromised by Palpatine. Instead, he takes a third option, trying to find his way into the criminal underworld, firstly by taking his opportunity in recruiting Hondo Ohnaka's men, and this story is now 2 times better now that Hondo is involved. One of the best characters in all of the Clone Wars. He does eventually drag out Kenobi, defeats him, but making the classic mistake of letting him live just to torture him. Now, I'd say generally that's stupid, but I completely get why he does this. It's completely in character. He doesn't just want Kenobi to die. No, he wants him to suffer, like he suffered. Though this plan more or less fails, which leads us directly into throughout this arc, we get a good look at Maul's strongest attribute. It's not his skill with a lightsaber, or his wit, or his force abilities, but instead his ability to create an opportunity. He and Savage encounter the Mandalorian extremist group Death Watch. There he makes a deal with them that he has no plan on keeping. He forms himself an army formed by the Force Coalition of various crime syndicates. Now, obviously Death Watch wants to take Mandalore, but he uses a siege of Mandalore to achieve 2 goals. 1. If he could take Mandalore, he then has direct access to thousands of neutrally aligned planets. Thus, if this goes well, he'd have his own sort of mini-empire. On top of that, he'd have the power of the Mandalorian military, which is nothing to scoff at. On top of already having a large army of gangsters. 2. He targets Duchess Satine knowing it'll draw out Kenobi. He's aware of their feelings for one another, and if he can attack something personal to Kenobi, that would just be another sweet topping of revenge. Of course, Brie Vizsla screws over Maul, but he isn't one to be down forever. In fact, he defeats Vizsla incredibly quickly, which is one of the most aura moments in all of the Clone Wars. Inserts a puppet Prime Minister of Mandalore, and now is the rightful winner of the Darksaber. Which, if you know your Star Wars lore, that's a pretty big deal. So, if you don't already know, you're probably wondering, how does this all fail? On paper, Maul is easily one of the most powerful men in the galaxy at this point. Well, there's one problem with all that. Palpatine, aka Darth Sidious. A key feature of Maul's character, and really why many of us find him so interesting, is that if Palpatine wasn't around, he'd probably be the main villain of Star Wars. Yet the issue is that Palpatine has had years more time to gain power and to insert himself into much higher positions of political control. Palpatine senses the threat that Maul is to him and gets directly involved. To explain to everyone why this is a big deal, this doesn't happen ever in any of the films or the shows. Palpatine would rather send his henchmen or apprentices to take care of the issue. But Maul is one of the rare times he directly appears to get rid of a problem, specifically to demolish Maul. Now, I know many would argue this dissipates all the intimidation Maul's built up over this arc, but does it really? He's made his mark. Nothing he's done can be undone. And really, at this point, the writers have absolutely sold us on Maul's return. I wanted to speak about this, to talk about how risks in writing really should be talked about more, especially when they pay off, and how we need to reward this risk-taking way more often. On paper, nothing about Darth Maul returning should work at all. And yet, it went off without a hitch. But this isn't because it's some sort of miracle. Nobody in the writer's room of the Clone Wars is just this demigod of writing. Nobody is. They're all just really solid writers. They understand the risks of bringing back a character that should be dead and took the time to flesh out their idea, to make sure it didn't feel too forced. They made the right choice of focusing on the characters and the world and how reintroducing Maul would affect that, but also showing there's a clear change in these characters. Maul and Kenobi have grown since their first encounter. That's good writing. If Maul was still the same character who was uber loyal to Palpatine, then why the hell would you bring him back in the first place? If absolutely nothing changes in a plot, not even slightly, then why introduce or reintroduce a character, or really any element? Of course, the plan for Maul has changed drastically since George Lucas's original plan, originally planning to make Maul the main villain of a sequel trilogy, which Disney basically instantly rejected. But no point getting overly angry about what ifs. Instead, let's just enjoy the great stuff we have, to be fairly critical when something doesn't work, and analyze when something does. And yeah, that's all I really got to say about that. This was just a fun, shorter video, because, I don't know, I'm a big Star Wars guy, and I wanted to talk about one of my favorite characters, and why this really shouldn't have worked, and yet it did. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. And if you did, like, comment, subscribe, you know the dribble at this point. And with all that being said, I'll see you next time.